Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome, Illinois, and hello from Washington, D.C. I am Jason Gross, Executive Director of the U.S. Global Leadership Coalition. It's good to join with all of you today. Typically, this is the season, as I was saying to Congressman Kinzinger, when we be welcoming all of you to D.C. for our annual State Leaders Summit and getting to see you in person. We really missed that, but we're glad at least we have the opportunity to connect in this way. We're certainly meeting at a heavy time for the United States and the world. We're all thinking about those who have suffered losses recently due to the pandemic, as well as the significant health, economic, social inequalities that have been raised in our country's dialogue over the past few weeks. But overall, we very sincerely hope that you and all of your families are safe and healthy. We are really pleased to be joined what will be eventually nearly 100 participants from Illinois today for this important discussion on America's role in the world in the midst of COVID-19 and why leading globally impacts us locally. Living proof of that right now. This is an important conversation. We're honored to have Congressman Adam Kinzinger with us today. We'll formally welcome him to the Zoom in a moment. But first, some quick logistics. You are all on mute right now, and we want to hear from you definitely later. So when I open up for the Q&A, there are a couple of ways to ask questions. On your computers, you can hit the raise hand function in Zoom, or on the phone, you can dial, if you're joining us that way, you can dial *9 to ask a question, and I can call on you. Or if you prefer to write your question, you can use the Q&A box you'll see at the bottom of your screen to type in your questions. This year, USGLC is proud to celebrate 25 years of building a better, safer world. And I want to tell you a little bit about who we are for any new faces who have joined us today. We are over 500 American businesses, humanitarian organizations, alongside our network nationwide of business, faith, military, and community leaders. Our bipartisan National Advisory Council is chaired by Secretary Colin Powell and is made up of our nation's top national security and foreign policy leaders, including every living former Secretary of State from Henry Kissinger to John Kerry. Our National Security Advisory Council is co-chaired by Admiral James Stavridis and General Tony Zinni. It is comprised of over 200 retired 3- and 4-star flag officers. Our Veterans for Smart Power initiative is made up of over 30,000 veterans from across the country who are committed to strengthening our non-military tools. And what brings us all together, all these unique voices, is a firm belief that we live in an interconnected world and that America needs to be engaged globally to advance our interests here at home. We talk about why a tiny 1% of the overall federal budget, called the International Affairs budget, is one of the most cost-effective and powerful investments America makes. It's sometimes called the foreign aid budget, but it's so much more than that. It funds our diplomats and embassies around the world and support for our key allies. It's our efforts to tackle global health threats, humanitarian disasters, impacts of climate change, and the root causes of terrorism. It's our work to combat corruption, promote the rule of law, advance democracy, and universal rights and freedoms. It's our programs that open new markets for American goods and services and public-private partnerships that are providing a hand up, not a handout, to millions around the globe. These programs are effective, they are accountable, transparent, and they deliver for the American people. We host forums like this with people all across the country, and we see that across political spectrums and state lines, Americans like you want to engage. COVID-19 has really underscored the importance of this fight, and we are so fortunate to be joined by an expert in Congress to help us think through this. We will also be joined by our friend Kathryn Unger from Cargill a little later in our program. Pleased to start off by introducing our special guest, whom you all know very well, Congressman Adam Kinzinger of the 16th District of Illinois. He's been hard at work to address the challenges of COVID-19 over the past months and to help keep the people of Illinois safe. Congressman Kinzinger is an expert in national security and foreign policy. He served in the U.S. Air Force in Iraq and Afghanistan and continues to serve with the Air National Guard. Today, he serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee and has an important seat at the table when it comes to advancing America's global leadership, especially when it comes to tackling global health threats like COVID-19. We were thrilled to honor you, Congressman, at our tribute dinner last November as part of the 4-country caucus, that bipartisan group of veterans in Congress committed to America's global leadership role. Congressman, thank you so much for joining us today. First, and most importantly, how are you and your family doing?
Oh, we're good. Thank you. Thanks for having me. And yeah, it's been an interesting time, that's for
Indeed.
sure. I'd like to get out of this and get back to normal, but we'll see.
Yes. You and us, Joe, you and us both on that. We'd love to have you maybe open up with a few words before we dive into the discussion of some thoughts on your mind about the topic today for your constituents.
Yeah, you bet. And again, thanks for having me, and to everybody on the call. Thank you. I'm in Illinois right now in Shanahan. It's a beautiful day outside, and I might go for a run after this. So, but really appreciate it. Look, I think the one thing that we have to take into mind is that this pandemic, as much as anything, has shown us that you can't retreat. You know, what happens in the rest of the world truly does affect the United States of America. It's not 1920 anymore. You can't just, say that we're bringing everybody home. We're going to just have our own economy and not worry about what's happening, because you have things like viruses. You have things like, frankly, wars now that can be brought to your shore, information technology issues. So the question in all of that then is, what is the role of the United States? And I think we have to go back to some of the things that we sometimes take for granted when we talk to people about the role, which is, if it's not the United States serving that capacity, does that mean that nobody serves the role as, I don't know, not leader of the world, but kind of the organizer, the people with the ability to bring together for common approaches? And the truth is, yes, somebody will. And right now, the most likely candidates for something like that are Russia or China. And as we all know, on this call, there is not any positive in either of those countries taking the world lead. So what does that mean? It means we have to continue to stay involved with organizations like NATO, stay involved with the United Nations, even though we should and are demanding changes to how some of the business is done. And it means, the importance here, foreign aid, international development. A lot of the times people look at foreign aid as a waste of money. And the vast majority of Americans actually believe that foreign aid takes up something like 25% of the federal budget. And it's not, it's a fraction of the budget. The problem is, it's like when you talk about going after terrorism, you can never really track what benefit it's done, because that benefit is usually the lack of something worse. So we don't know how many terrorist attacks we've actually prevented since 9/11 in the United States. So that gives people sometimes a feeling that we don't need counterterrorism, but of course we do. And it's the same when it comes to things like economic development and human rights development. How many wars have we not been in because we've spent a little bit of money on making sure that people have an opportunity? If you think about the continent of Africa, one of the most interesting things is that actually the biggest pushback against terrorism has not necessarily been the US or the French military. It plays an important role, but it's been things like the introduction of the free market system and giving people hope and opportunity, taking people from being in a position where they believe that their bad situation or their lack of opportunity is a result of some other country or some people or ethnic group, and you're much more likely at that point then to be recruited into a terrorist organization. Instead, if you have opportunity and you have hope, you're much less likely to join an extremist group, not just in terrorism, but sometimes even within your own country, and instability. So this is why it's essential that not just members of Congress, we're going to continue to do what we can, as I have, to fight for that role of foreign aid in the budget, things like international development. But this is where local leaders and especially in business arena need to be involved too. You have a forum to make points. Obviously, you're a taxpayer, so you have a say in how that tax money is spent. And you also have stories that we don't have, stories of maybe opportunities that arose in a country because of the work of US foreign aid or because of the work of diplomats. Or so those are the kind of things where especially we need as we go forward, because my biggest fear right now is that, and it really is actually my biggest fear, which is the temptation when the dust settles from COVID, and we look at the national debt, we look at all this stuff, the temptation is going to be to withdraw from the world. And that will be the exact opposite of what we need to do. So that's why we need your voice. And I'll tell you, USGLC has been amazing. And I have, traveled with them, worked a lot with them. Your involvement in the organization is extremely important because it does have a good impact. and it's not a partisan issue. I mean, you know, I'm sure we'll get questions that can have a partisan bend to it, and that's fine. I understand it. But in reality, Republicans and Democrats are really united on the basics on this stuff and the need for it. I mean, as an example, I led a letter with the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee to the president, basically saying that the withdrawal of U.S. troops out of Germany is not a good idea at a time when we need to make it very clear that we're standing with our allies. So this isn't a partisan issue. We need to continue to go forward in this bipartisan way to make sure that America's role is defended, because, you know, maybe for a few years, if we abandon this position, it may seem fine, but that's not going to last very long, and we'll realize that mistake very clearly and very quickly. So with that, I'll in my opening remarks, happy to answer any questions and continue on.
A lot of food for thought there, Congressman. And I'm reminded, and obviously your constituents are reminded here about how fortunate they are to have such a leader on national security, foreign policy, looking after them on Capitol Hill. And I'm reminded actually of your remarks about the unsung role of development and diplomacy for our national security. I'm remembering remarks by a longtime leader in our coalition, Bill Lane, from one of that iconic Illinois company, Caterpillar. He likens the role of development and diplomacy to the fire marshal, not the firefighter. The firefighter are heroes, and they put out those blazes when things go wrong. It's the fire marshal that's trying to prevent the fire from starting in the first place, and that's what that role is right there. So we don't have to engage the military unnecessarily too often too, and it's that unsung role that sometimes isn't so visible, but is so valuable to limit the conflict we're engaged with, and why so many of your constituents are involved in this organization, because they see that value. But let's build on your remarks. You had a lot of food for thought, as I said, to start us off. Today's conversation, we're going to focus on COVID-19, America's role in the global response, and discuss why it matters to our interests and values before opening up to questions from our attendees today. I want to open up things with a quick video clip and get your reaction afterwards, Congressman. So let's play that video clip right now.
Today, the greatest risk of global catastrophe doesn't look like this. Instead, it looks like this. If anything kills over 10 million people in the next few decades, it's most likely to be a highly infectious virus rather than a war. Not missiles, but microbes. Now, part of the reason for this is that we have invested a huge amount in nuclear deterrence, but we've actually invested very little in a system to stop an epidemic. We're not ready for the next epidemic.
Now, Congressman, that was Bill Gates 5 years ago, warning us we were not ready, and without a doubt, the world is still not ready today. 70% of the world remains unprepared to respond to a pandemic. 10 countries in Africa today have no ventilators at all. So as a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, you're no stranger to these issues. And as we address the urgent domestic challenges, of course, of this crisis that we have, why don't we start off by saying, why is it also in our interest to promote global health security, helping other countries prevent and respond to infectious disease threats?
Well, I'll start close to home and then kind of work out, I guess. So, you know, on the overline view, it's a moral issue, right? The more people we can save, the better. You obviously saw the massive advances we've done in terms of deterring AIDS in Africa, for instance. And so there's the humanitarian quality of it, which is it's just right to do. Close to home, though, let's look at the actual real impacts. Right now, you have a virus surging in Mexico, in Brazil. Central America, although they're not seeing massive surges, it's had a massive effect on the economy, the lockdowns, particularly if you think of El Salvador. And we fully expect that when those lockdowns lift and the dust settles, as I say all the time, we're going to have a massive surge at the U.S. border. So what does that mean? Not just for the economic impacts, not just for the border surge and illegal immigration, but also for the people that have to trek through cartel-held territory in Mexico, for instance. And many of them get picked up and trafficked, and it really is a devastating story. A lot of people die in that process. So that's the real kind of narrow near term. On the distance term, where's the next war going to be? We don't actually know that, right? Some people say, well, it's going to be with China. Actually, probably likely not, though it's possible. It could be somewhere in Africa. It could be somewhere again in the Middle East. Could be somewhere, God forbid, in Eastern Europe. But that's going to come out of desperate situations. So desperate situations right now exist because of what this virus has done and the impact on the economy. People have gone from poor countries to unbelievably poor countries when we see what happens ultimately. Look at the nation of Georgia, for instance, that I'm very, very close to. You know, good economic growth. Now they have the virus situation going on. It's got the economic impact. What's going to be the future of Georgia, and how is Russia, for instance, going to try to take advantage of that? So it's extremely important that we maintain that role, not in funding everything. There's a role for US funding, of course, but in organizing responses and having a central clearinghouse for information. And this may be controversial, but it's the right thing to say, I think, which is also holding people accountable that hide information. And we know for a fact that China and the Chinese Communist Party particularly withheld information from the WHO and the United States and the rest of the world, and it has an impact. That needs to be held accountable as well, so that we can ensure there's better systems for reporting in the future, whether that's through the WHO, you know, or any other organization. So this impact that this is going to have, I think we're underthinking, which is why I was happy to have this discussion, because I don't think we understand yet how intense this is going to be.
Yeah. That role of diplomacy is so key as well. I mean, part of it are development funding to help address directly the global health crises that emerge, but there's a diplomatic side about leading on the civilian side, on sharing information, best practices, on getting the information out there that we need to, that uniquely our foreign service and our embassies and our diplomats can do. Such a key important part of this. Let me turn to our second panelist joining us today. Welcome Kathryn Unger of Cargill joining us. She's going to join us momentarily on the screen. And Kathryn opens up her video screen to join us. Kathryn serves as Vice President. There she is. Good afternoon, Kathryn. Great to have you with us.
Good afternoon, Cargill.
Kathryn is Vice President of North America Government Relations for Cargill. Previously was Managing Director at Cargill's Aqua Nutrition Division. So thank you so much for joining us today. And I want to kick things off by sharing a video about Cargill's important work and relevance to today's discussion very much soon. We'll continue our discussion right after that on the other side.
National security and food security are deeply intertwined. I have a very unique background. I came from special operations. I'm also a large animal veterinarian that works for Cargill Health Technologies, specifically around supporting food security. And I also work in the Air Force as a reservist. I command a medical unit specifically designed to extract injured soldiers, sailors, and airmen and bring them home. It's a very rewarding job. I've been involved in combat operations. I've learned that if we have to get into a gun battle, we make 200 enemies. However, if you go into a region to feed their families, you make 200 friends.
We work for a leading global food and agriculture company. We know that when we invest in programs that help address food security and help improve livelihoods around the world, we're making a difference for those countries and those communities.
If we go in and we help make them sustainable, there's a win-win for America. We don't put our servicemen at risk, but we also work in a great partnership with USAID and other NGOs. When you help somebody and you make long-term friends, they see America as someone who cares about them, who cares about their family, who cares about their country.
Cargill partners with others to be able to reach scale. Organizations like the World Food Program or CARE or USAID. We can't do it on our own. One example of that is a partnership that we have called Hatching Hope. It has a bold, ambitious target to reach 100 million people through the production and consumption of poultry. And we're supporting She Feeds the World, which is an effort to reach 2 million women.
Food security isn't just about making sure that you're fed. Food security is the basis for where society can then go. Education for your children, your medical needs, these things track after you've been fed.
And so some of the work that we do in terms of farmer training, linking farmers to financing, ultimately linking them to markets, is how we can help smallholder producers around the world.
When you combine the will, the heart, the technology, you can change the world.
Kathryn, as we saw in that pretty cool video there, addressing food insecurity is more important than ever. in the face of a global pandemic, with World Food Program Executive Director David Beasley warning that we could see famines of biblical proportions as a result of the food crises brought on by COVID-19. Cargill's playing an important role in the U.S. global response to COVID-19, doing what it does best, of course, feeding the world by providing food to thousands of families from Ghana to Bolivia to Turkey. Given that Cargill is an American company that is supporting communities both here in the U.S. and around the world, can you expand on why it's in America's interest to be engaged in the global response to this pandemic and its repercussions?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Jason, for the opportunity to be here with everyone today. You know, I really appreciated the words that the Congressman said, that you need opportunity and hope in order for people to survive and to carry forward. And that's also what was part of what you heard in the video. You know, when you think about the hierarchy of needs, food security is the foundation upon which everything else is built. And so Cargill's work is to nourish the world in a safe, responsible, and sustainable way. And that has never been more important, in particular during this COVID-19 crisis. The crisis has really punctuated the critical importance of what we do. Every day, our 160,000 Cargill employees go to work in 70 countries, and we're deeply committed to feeding people and animals around the world. You know, Cargill is a huge company, but a lot of people have never heard of it. You know, 7 years ago, before I really started with Cargill, I couldn't have told you exactly what Cargill does. And people don't know the value that our supply chains provide in all of our everyday lives. But during this pandemic, the resilience of our employees and the strength of our partnerships with our customers, communities, and nonprofit partners have really helped ensure that our farmers and ranchers have a market in which to sell their product. And that's one of the kind of primary things that we absolutely make sure of. We make sure that fish and livestock operations can keep their animals fed. We make sure that grocers can stock their shelves, restaurants can serve their customers, and families around the world have food on their plates. And so Cargill has a major role to play. We're always proud to partner with our farmers, retail and food service customers, NGOs, and government leaders, both here in the United States and around the world, to maintain the stability of the food systems we all rely on for our nourishment and to secure the markets that our farmers, ranchers, and food producers depend on for their livelihoods. It's all intertwined. But the COVID-19 pandemic demands that we go a little bit further. Cargill and the United States have the unique opportunity and responsibility to lead during this global crisis. And that is why Cargill has taken an active role in supporting the communities where we live and work. So some of the things we've done here in the US include donating more than 3 million pounds of food to alleviate hunger here in the US. We've also supported the World Food Program USA and Actions for Healthy Kids. The American Farmland Trust's Farmer Relief Fund, the Restaurant Employee Relief Fund, and local food banks and service organizations. So that's some of what we've done here. Abroad, we've also transformed some of our plant operations to produce hand sanitizer for local hospitals. We've committed $35 million to our COVID-19 efforts, and that includes $16 million for meals in relief efforts in India, providing food for over 1,000 families in Ghana. You know, to the point the Congressman made, we've provided food vouchers to communities in Central America. So we've been helping both domestically and abroad. So basically, I think you hear a lot of people saying we're all in this together. And for Cargill, that truly does mean all of us worldwide. And so doing our part to feed the world is really what we do best. It's our mission. It's why we're here. And it's the right thing to do, as the Congressman said, to support and grow the developing economies that will support our U.S. agricultural growth in years to come.
Thank you, Kathryn. And Congressman, we saw in that video, we saw definitely that link between food security, national security. So I want to talk more national security with you too, you know, with your expertise. COVID-19 certainly exacerbating instability in fragile states, which could have some serious repercussions for our own safety here at home. Extremist attacks in sub-Saharan Africa increased by 37% in recent months. Pentagon's warned us of a potential resurgence of ISIS in Syria. In your tours as an Air Force pilot, now as a member of the House Foreign Affairs Subcommittee on the Middle East, North Africa, international terrorism, you see firsthand these challenges posed by fragile states. Tell us what keeps you up at night. How worried are you about these destabilizing impacts this pandemic can have in already fragile regions around the world?
Yeah, look, I'd like to say something cool like Matt has said, like I keep people up at night, but the reality is I think that, yes, it's a very, very concerning situation, the aftermath. What I'm most concerned about, honestly, and what keeps me up at night is the instability in the United States. And I think part of the reason, the protests were well-founded to protest. I think part of the reason it went to looting and violence was because people had felt cooped up. There was a lot of pent-up energy. There's a lot of animosity right now that has built. I think there's something very human to the fact that if you can't even touch each other or shake hands, it's hard to see the value in a human being if you're basically isolated and alone. And then the misinformation, and this is going to exist. All these things exist with other countries as well, but especially with other countries, the misinformation. So, there are some people that believe the virus isn't even real. It's a big government hoax. There's some people believe that it's the end of society. You can get on Facebook and look at people's angry posts about, we don't want to wear a mask, or I saw somebody outside that wasn't wearing a mask. And we have become each other's enemies in this, instead of really looking at who U.S. competition is and understanding it's just disagreements politically. So that's actually what keeps me up at night. And the instability in the rest of the world is the exact same thing. So you have the same dynamics that exist everywhere in terms of the isolation. You have, for instance, if you look in the Syria situation now, what has this done to the U.S. military, whether it's in Syria or whether it's in the Asian Pacific? Well, when we had, U.S. carriers that went down, there was a lack of U.S. military presence at that moment. What is this virus going to have to the future of that? It's impactful. And so if you look at, for instance, again, Syria, while we saw a settling down of violence for the moment because of it, the anger is going to erupt. And I actually think you'll see more instability there. And by the way, when this whole thing kicked off, even the worst predictions of what would happen in Syria have been exceeded to where we are now. And so I think to say that this is going to be a problem would be an understatement. It's something that I can't predict what it's going to look like, but I can tell you that it's going to be massive. And this is where that stabilizing, calming force of the United States is going to be important, because if people aren't hungry, if they have opportunities, they're much less likely to be violent or enemies.
The pandemic direct challenges to our readiness, our military readiness, as you talked about, but also potentially to the mission of our hard power and the challenges of our smart and soft power to be able to try and mitigate those, keeping these fragile states from tipping into failed states and becoming more serious, as you're talking about there, which puts strains on regions and raises the threshold potentially for us to have to considering using force as opposed to trying to tamp these down. I mean, a lot of challenges. I want to follow up on something, Congressman, also you mentioned earlier that you did travel to with USGLC in the past, Ethiopia and Kenya several years ago. You had the opportunity to see USAID programs addressing hunger firsthand. We have some photos from that trip you took with us. Can you remember back to that trip and share what you saw there that showed how an effective foreign assistance programs, including strengthening food security, can help mitigate instability, provide a hand up for communities working to become self-reliant? Remembering that trip you took a couple of years ago with us? See Tom Emmer there as well, your colleague?
I got to tell you, it was it's a trip I talk about all the time. And in fact, I was getting ready to tell the story and I'm like, I'll wait for a second. And I hadn't actually even put together at that moment that it was the USGLC trip. I just was like, oh, this memory. There was one specifically, we went to a village that, so Ethiopia, we saw where we had created basically a coffee exchange. So now you had farmers that were growing coffee that were now able to get a fair price and actually be competitive instead of, at the mercy of the local buyer, et cetera. And that was done. I think CME did a lot for that. And so that was actually pretty awesome. But the one that impacted me the most was a village in Kenya. And we went in there and, we pull up in our couple of SUVs so nobody knows what to expect, right? We see this co-op that was built for milk so that farmers could take their milk there and sell and exchange and make money. But then we went into a village where it was a couple with, I think, 2 or 3 kids. They had a plot that was probably the size of my living room here. And that's what they lived on, tiny house. And they had a couple of cows. And these cows, as it was explained to me, you know, they never knew how to feed or really take care of them so they could produce a lot of milk. So a U.S. Graduate from the University of Illinois in ag sciences went there with USAID and began to teach these villagers the best way to take care of cows, how to, my knowledge of cow taking care of isn't the best, but you know, how to grow things hydroponically so that they can feed them and all this kind of stuff. And it had revolutionized their life. So these people were telling me the story, extremely excited. We used to produce 2 quarts of milk or whatever, and now we're at 10 times that. We make more money than we ever thought we'd make. Still living in utter abject poverty, but the appreciation for what this young man did in the limited resources that was invested by the United States of America revolutionized that village. And by the time I remember in that tour, there were maybe 4 or 8 bystanders kind of watching us. By the end of that, there were 50 to 100 of them standing around. They didn't know who I was. You know, they hadn't seen like Fox or CNN or anything, but they knew us from the United States of America, and they knew that we changed their life. And that had reverberated through the whole village and surrounding villages. And it's just a small example of what a little impact can make. And I'll tell you, you're never going to recruit an enemy out of a village like that.
Right. That's powerful. Congressman, we promise to keep your animal husbandry knowledge limited to this call here as well. So that just stays here in the confines of it. But what a story to tell. And we're so opportunity and proud to be able to take you on that trip and show the impact. And as you said earlier, we have implementers on this call from Illinois who know firsthand, can testify about when U.S. foreign assistance is done effectively, it can make all the difference in the world about stability and about deterring people from extremism and into the family of nations, and such an important testimony from you as well from that trip that you still bring up to this day. That's really great. We talked national security, food security. Let's talk about the economy as well. So important looking forward. I want to turn to Kathryn for that, to think about that. I mean, we know this impact of the pandemic, what it's doing domestically, what it's doing to the world economy. IMF predictions the global economy could lose as much as $9 trillion in GDP over the next 2 years. We don't even know the extent of it right now as we're standing. But what we do know is that 50% of U.S. exports are going to emerging markets, from Latin America to Africa, Southeast Asia, which are already being devastated by the pandemic. Cargill, as we know, is a global company with a massive exporting presence, accounting for over 25% of all U.S. grain exports. Can you share your concerns about the global economic outlook in the months to come, and how is our own economic future directly tied to the recovery of emerging markets, so that when we need to recover from this pandemic, get our economy jump-started, we got to have markets to be able to send it to. And if those markets are being ravaged, displaced by COVID-19, our customer base abroad is going to be unable to be able to buy our exports as much as they did before.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is such an important question that so many people don't quite understand the connectivity here. But one of our most important and impactful tools for development and diplomacy is trade. It's also one of our most important tools in achieving zero hunger, which is one of Cargill's goals. So the 3 food security pillars are access, nutrition, and stable supply. And those are impossible without trade. So when you think about the fact that 95% of the world's consumers live outside of the United States, and some of the fastest growing markets are actually in the developing world, and you think about where our farmers need to sell their product, building up developing nations through investments in development, farmer training, building schools and infrastructure, and developing relationships across borders is essential, not only to improving people's lives, but also to building those new markets where we want to sell. Again, 95% of the world's consumers live outside of the United States, but our farmers are some of the most productive in the world. Where are they going to sell that? So trade helps people in developing nations advance beyond mere subsistence and enter the consumer class, which is where they generate new demand for goods that further bolsters the robustness of trade. This is great, in particular with respect to agriculture. So developing countries are projected to account for more than 80% of the increase in global demand for meat, grains, and oil seeds between now and 2026. Again, think about the markets for our US farmers. So it's more important than ever to look beyond our traditional markets and pursue every opportunity to build access. And again, it's not just because of profits, it's also because it's the right thing to do. And it's in the interest of our US farmers across our heartland to do that as well.
Thanks, Kathryn. Third pillar of USGLC's messaging, Congressman, as you know well now, has always been about our humanitarian values as a people. I mean, we talk about bolstering our security, looking forward to our economic growth and prosperity, but there's something about our values as Americans that are really important about expressing it for why we try and deal with the pandemic abroad as we do at home. I want to turn to the audience right now who's joined us today and put a poll up on the screen, actually, little interaction with our audience. As you can see, the poll, this comes from, according to one of the leading NGOs, the International Rescue Committee, and this is just for our participants today to select in the poll. The question is up to how many people of the world's 34 most conflict-affected and fragile states are at risk of contracting COVID-19. Your selections on the screen would be 100 million at risk, 500 million at risk, or 1 billion. We'll give you a second to answer, then we'll show you the answer on the screen. See that answer right now. So the answer is 1 billion. The majority of you got it. It's a good, smart attendees today understanding the scale that we face right now of this pandemic, a staggering and unprecedented global humanitarian crisis. Congressman, I want to go back to, you brought up Syria earlier, and that's certainly, you know, as a case in point, when we look at refugees, displaced persons, we're right now facing in the world the highest number of displaced persons, of refugees since World War II right now. And these are vulnerable populations right now. You look at Syria, recent violence has led to more than 50 medical facilities in the Idlib province to be shutting down operations. We're concerned about the spread of COVID-19 in Syria having disastrous consequences you alluded to earlier. You are the co-chair of the Syria caucus. You wrote to Secretary of State Pompeo, UN Ambassador Kraft, calling for diplomatic and foreign assistance efforts to help respond to the humanitarian crisis there. What is that example? Maybe you want to use Syria or another one we've seen with the Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, one of the largest refugee camps in the world, COVID-19 hitting there. These are the most vulnerable populations in the world right now, suffering so much. And now on top of that, this COVID-19 pandemic hitting them as well. That can't be good overall for what we want to see as Americans for the world and stability across the world right now.
Yeah, absolutely not. And I mean, it goes without saying, you think about the conditions in many refugee camps. Obviously, social distancing is not easy to do, if even possible. You talk about, in some cases, sanitary conditions. You know, you don't have as much access to running water as we constantly do. And so something like COVID-19 can flash through like wildfire. It also leads to an opportunity for conspiracy theories. I mean, I guarantee you there are going to be people that say in camps like that this is the West, or this is, you know, Christians, or whatever it is that they blame in order to recruit into more extremist beliefs. And that also, you know, extremism spreads like wildfire as well. And then you think about just the impact of, okay, refugee camps and what has the movement of people done? It's created massive conflicts between peoples in Europe, for instance, considered to be, with the United States, one of the most stable areas of the world. And so you have the humanitarian aspect of, again, our heartbreaking, and how do we ever, you know, come up and say again that this stuff is important to us when these situations went ignored, you know, while in some cases, you know, we're not infinite, we can't do everything. But even to bring attention and make efforts is important. You lose your moral authority to be able to do something when it's even more important to us in the future. But also you do run the risk, which we've already seen, of spreading instability to countries that were once considered stable and that we rely on and need. So it's a tragic situation, and something that I think once we get out of this kind of immediate survival state to talk about the hierarchy of needs of our own country, hopefully we pay some more attention to. And we have been, It's just the media obviously is not interested in covering it because it's not, as scandalous as what's happening here.
Fair points all around. Great conversation so far. Why don't we open this up for some questions from your constituents as well to hear from them? We have John DeRue has had his hand raised patiently in the chat room. So John, we're going to turn your mic on and please ask your question of the Congressman and Kathryn today. Go ahead.
Congressman, as a military veteran and having served in military bases, Europe, Asia, around the world, I've had the opportunity to see both our defense and our civilian efforts firsthand. It's obvious to me that the non-military options are a lot more cost-effective, both in personnel, in dollars, and in long-range actions. So given the importance of what's going on right now, I just want to pass on to you that I and other veterans like me are strongly encourage you to keep going on your efforts, your bipartisan efforts in this international support. Please continue to do that.
Thank you. Thanks for bringing that up, and thank you for your service. And the military is awesome. So whenever people thank me, I kind of chuckle inside because I'm like, nah, thanks for paying your taxes so I can fly planes. But I appreciate it. But you make a good point on that. Of course, the cost and the impact. And I think it's important to note, when we come out of this COVID-19 pandemic, we'll be maybe 30 trillion, maybe more in debt. We went in at 20 to 21 trillion in debt. So think of that cost, $9 trillion because of something that affected us. If I could show a crystal ball and say last year or 2 years ago, we can invest $1 trillion and prevent this from happening, there's not a soul in the world that wouldn't have voted yes on that proposal. And so the key is to take past examples and project into the future and try to explain that issue. It's much cheaper to prevent COVID-19 than it is to react to it in multiple ways. And that, is multiplied times 1,000 in every conflict or every potential conflict and every potential disease.
John, thank you for your service too, and for that question to keep us going. I want to turn to another John here from another iconic Illinois institution from Rotary International joining us. John Huco, I believe you have your hand raised there. Please go ahead and ask your question today too, and glad to have you joining us.
Again, great, Jason. Thank you so much. Again, John Huco from Rotary International, Rotary Foundation. We're based in Evanston, our world headquarters. Proud to be here. Either Congressman or Kathryn, I think one of Rotary's signature initiatives, global initiatives, has been the eradication of polio. And we've been very effective and very successful in getting it down from 350,000 cases a year down to, let's say, 62 so far this year. In Afghanistan and Pakistan are the two last remaining countries. And of course, the way we were able to come be on the verge of eradicating this disease is a very safe and effective vaccine. And all the health experts seem to be indicating that for us to really get out of this crisis permanently, we're going to need to have a safe and effective vaccine. And of course, the concern is that many of us have is that the growing anti-vaxxer movement, particularly in the United States. So I just wondered if your thoughts on what steps should Congress be taking, what steps could private sector, civil society organizations be taking to really beat back this, for lack of a better word, this anti-vaxxer movement, stress the importance of vaccines, because in some ways this really is the permanent solution to this crisis and all the various knockoff effects that we've been talking about at this webinar. So just your thoughts on how we deal with this, the vaccination and the anti-vaccination issue with COVID.
Well, I'll start on the Congress side and then turn it over. But I would have told you before this happened, sadly, we probably need a pandemic to prove to people the effectiveness of vaccines. And maybe we'll get there in a year when we have a vaccine and then, it basically kills this virus. Again, hoping we have a vaccine. We don't have one for AIDS. So, we've been working on that. It's a difficult thing because you're dealing with misinformation. There's all kinds of science on why it's easy to believe conspiracy theories. And I have somebody that's fairly close to my family that's, massively conspiracy theory. And I have tracked every conspiracy theory, including end of the world stuff, and all of them are false. But nobody remembers when a conspiracy theory actually doesn't take effect. If you're thinking the end of the world is September 12th, and then it's September 13th, for about a day you think about it, and then you forget you ever believed it. And that's the problem. So there's no real track record. And then the other, of course, issue is, the one study that showed it was linked to autism was roundly rejected later and denounced by some of the people that even wrote the study. It's been 100% criticized. But when I talk to my anti-vaxxer person that's close to me about it, they just remind me that all the studies have been funded by big pharma companies. So there's never a way out of it. I think the key on that is going to be continue to talk about the effectiveness of them, continue to denounce the theories as ridiculous, but not the people, because they'll take that personally and entrench. And ultimately, if we get an effective COVID vaccine, we will now, I think, be able to actually track the effectiveness of it versus, the last new vaccine where it was a huge issue. People just didn't, there weren't anti-vaxxers at that time. Now we have them. But I appreciate it. It's a huge problem.
John, thanks for the question. And obviously Rotary has done heroic work around the world in combating polio and facing head on some of those challenges of vaccine acceptance, famously in northern Nigeria as well, for cultural reasons at times that helped stymie their efforts that have been so comprehensive. And we move towards eliminating polio, so close to that goal across the world. And I mean, it's a situation with COVID that we're seeing distracting us from other global health challenges we have right now. Seeing Ebola reemerge in the DRC a few weeks ago too. I mean, this is the other challenge. Talk about the effect on food security and extremism. We have such momentum on global health progress too, that this can sidetrack that really needed work to keep people out of the health system when we need them so much for stretching fragile health systems in the developing world, is why this full court press is so important to make sure we don't squander the momentum that Rotary and those heroes in combating polio have made. Let me turn over to Peggy Parfenoff's had her hand raised patiently as well from World Chicago in the chat room. Peggy, why don't you go ahead and ask your question too, if you're
Hi, Congressman. Thank you for being here. And you've always been a strong champion for maintaining relations with our overseas allies like NATO. And at World Chicago, we worked with the State Department as well. How can we take advantage of these relationships we already have in place to help fight this pandemic, both at home and overseas?
Yeah, that's a great question. So obviously coordination, right? There's a lot of tension, I'll politely say, between Europe and the United States right now. Some of it's the president's own words and tweets. But I think that's a bond that's not going to break. I mean, actually, if you look back to articles from the 1980s, Europe hated Ronald Reagan. And, there was talk about the U.S. leaving Europe at the time, too. And, of course, looking back, and putting that in perspective, it's a different view. So I think the key right now for us is strengthening institutions, of course, like NATO on the defense side, and then internationally working with making sure we're bringing together the Europeans under a common kind of goal, articulating that goal, which is protecting our own people and then protecting folks outside of our boundaries because of even just the national interest of it, not to mention the humanitarian interest is going to be important. And I think it's countering misinformation, from Russia, from China, from disparate groups or extremist groups that are trying to build a wedge between the United States and Europe, that are trying to, one thing I worry about is the Chinese government walking in after the pandemic. And now you have a country, let's just say Italy, because they were hit hard, having to choose between a huge aid package offered by the Chinese government or actually resisting the Chinese government because of security threats, et cetera. So I think it's going to be important, first off, to articulate, which we haven't done well, the reasons we all need to work together, and then find the mechanisms to do it. I will address the WHO thing really quick because I think the WHO plays a very important role. It plays a role that the CDC couldn't play, for instance, because that's nationally focused. But I am extremely disappointed in the WHO right now and the cover-ups, I think, frankly, that occurred, not necessarily by that as an organization, but by people within it. And so that's where I think it's important for the United States to use its leverage, not to demand that we fully get our way. By the way, the Chinese do that, though, demand they get their way. but to ensure that at least we're getting good information and being treated fairly. Ignoring Taiwan's warnings because Taiwan is not recognized by China is a problem, and all this kind of stuff. So I think reforming the WHO with our allies, pushing back against misinformation with our allies, and then investing with our allies in systems of the future to be able to recognize this stuff faster. I think we're going to come out of this stronger. It's going to take a while, but there will be some massive advances like there is with any war, frankly, when it's over. Thank you.
Peggy, thanks for that question. Got a question here I want to throw to you, Kathryn, from Adam Olson in the chat room, who put out this question about food insecurity and hunger. By some measures, Yemen is currently suffering from the world's worst humanitarian crisis because of war, plus subsequent hunger and disease. COVID-19 is now making that situation worse. What can the United States do to end the crisis in Yemen? Maybe that's not exactly in your bailiwick, but the role that we're playing, I think, that food insecurity in fragile societies around the world, you talked about that how critical that's going to be as an element of our response to COVID-19 in places like Yemen and other really food insecure places in Africa, in the Middle East, and Latin America, where we need to help out.
Yeah, so specifically around Yemen, I can understand the concern there, and something that I've been kind of keeping an eye on is other areas that have been incredibly, that were already weak in terms of the support that they needed. And so I think of that in terms of women and girls, right? When you look at the impact of COVID-19, women and girls around the world have suffered a disproportionate financial impact of the coronavirus. And, one of the things that we need to be thinking about is how investments in economic empowerment of women and girls will help lift those societies out of poverty. And those are already the most vulnerable societies. And so, the question that we've been talking about is, why is that good for the U.S. economy? And, we are working in partnership with, to the previous question, leveraging partnerships that already exist. We've been working in partnership with groups such as Poverty is Sexist, and working to really correct the gender imbalance that's happening there around the world. Women have access to less than 1% of the world's land, even though we produce 50% of the world's food. And an estimated 75% of the world's women cannot go to the bank and get a loan. And 55% of the world's women are not in school. This has gotten worse because of the coronavirus and not better. But when women and girls have opportunities to participate economically, household incomes rise, productivity increases, children have better care, and all of that leads to more stability throughout the world. And so we are working with the One Campaign, Hatching Hope, She Feeds the World, and other organizations because they're the right thing to do, but also because we recognize that, again, women and girls have been disproportionately impacted across the world by the coronavirus, and we're trying to do something to help improve that situation.
Great causes and great cause to be helping out overall. And Kathryn, thanks for sharing Cargill's commitment there. Congressman, it's been a great discussion today so far. It could go on a lot longer. We have more hands raised and can go even more than the hour we talked about, but we promised everyone an hour today and want to stick to that. I'd love to close with your thoughts. We've had a lot of heavy discussion today, important discussion about weighty issues, but I'd love to ask you if we can end on a positive note somewhat of what's giving you hope in these uncertain times as we look towards a horizon, a post-COVID-19 horizon of where we're going to be as a country and a world as we determine to recover from this crisis and persevere and get through it. What's your positive outlook on where we're going to be going after this?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I do have a positive outlook. If you look at, the vast amount of information available to us through the internet, it's something that's led to social instability to an extent because it's relatively new on how to deal with it, how to push back against misinformation, for instance. But also in that same note, it has overthrown oppressive governments because it's allowed people to organize and discuss and to almost do democracy underneath, a repressive regime. I think as we understand how best to personally moderate that information so that we're not being bombarded constantly and with wrong stuff, I think that's going to propel people into a pretty self-determined future. I also think that the advances that we're going to have out of this, you know, you think about my generation's war and the advances in what we understand about brain science and post-traumatic stress. You now move that over to the medical side. We have very quickly gone from talking about telemedicine, for instance, as a theory to it being put into practice, and now probably 5 years ahead of where we would have been otherwise. Advances in understanding how to do things like vaccines, how to share information. And I think it may not be in the next year, but when we look back from a historical perspective on what's going on, I think this will be a moment where the world, and particularly our country, grew in leaps and bounds. You look at the social instability on the street. You know, you have people now actually having conversations that should have happened. You know, what is it that me as a white guy am scared about? What's my perception of this? Okay, well, as an African American, what is your perception? Why do we have this big difference? And I think being able to get past the uncomfort of having those conversations is great hope for the future as well. And so I'm actually really optimistic in the long term, even though I think, you know, of course, the next few months or God forbid years aren't going to be as fun as they could be. I do think it's an opportunity to really make some advances. And so I'm optimistic in the long run.
Thank you for that close. Kathryn, thank you for joining us today as well. Congressman, every time we talk, we're reminded of why you were such a friend to this coalition and the members in Illinois who lead in our state advisory committee because of your passion and intellect and understanding of having a comprehensive national security strategy, development, diplomacy alongside defense for a 3D strategy. There is no one better at it than you at explaining it and convincing. And we are just grateful, and your constituents are reminded again of your leadership in Washington on these issues. So we wish you the best. Thank you for your service. Thank you for everything you're doing for Illinois and for USGLC. And I want to close it up today with my colleague, Robert Watson, to talk about our further ongoing activities in Illinois and around the country. Robert.
Thanks for that, Jason. And thank you, Congressman Kinzinger and Kathryn Unger, for this conversation today during what is really a pivotal moment for our country. So it's very important to us. And also, thanks again to Cargill for serving as USGLC's Heartland Chair. We really do appreciate that, and it's a privilege working with you. We really do appreciate that each of you joined us today, particularly our Illinois Advisory Committee and the members of our Veterans for Smart Power initiative. We're all very grateful to Representative Kinzinger for his unwavering support for America's global leadership, especially, again, at this very critical time. It's a great conversation we're having. Thanking your congressperson and sharing your positions is really critical to keeping America's leadership around the world strong so that we protect our economic interests, our national security, and of course, our humanitarian values as well. Your voice really does make all the difference, so please do stay engaged. For up-to-the-minute updates, make sure you're on our mailing lists, follow us on Twitter, and of course, join us for our upcoming virtual events, for which there are many. So thanks again for your support during these difficult times. It means a lot to have you on board with us. I enjoy hearing from all of you, so I look forward to our conversations going forward, and stay well. Thank you again.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Kathryn. Be well.
Thanks so much, both of you.